I have to say, I struggled with what I was going to talk about, and I had favorite scriptures I looked at, and well, that's not quite right. So, I just thought I'd, with some of you that have heard my story already, share my story. And I find in my life I learn a lot, not only from books, but from people and their stories and their walk with Christ. So I just thought I'd be among friends, be really transparent today. I hesitate to do that because it's not all about me, but it's all about the Lord. But yet we demonstrate what, as Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ, type of thing. So I was born at a very early age, and in a place called Crookston, Minnesota, northwestern part of Minnesota. It's not the end of the earth, but you can see the end of the earth from there, and it's so flat, you can watch your dog run away from home for 3 days. And, well, the other thing, you can stand on a tuna can and see the Rocky Mountains from there. Very small town, actually. It's so small, the entering and leaving sign are on the same post. Thank you, Bill, for prompting me. That's great. And people don't use their turn signal because everybody knows where you're going. Oh my God. I'll stop there.
I'll be here all week.
The town is called, the actual town, my high school was Fertile, Minnesota. And there's a lot of jokes about Fertile. It was named after Fertile, Iowa, and you know where that is, Dick. And the guy that established our town was from Fertile, Iowa, and he was very creative. He said, well, I'll call this Fertile too, I guess. But the headline in the local, in Iowa was Fertile Woman Marries Manly Man from Iowa. And then there's another joke from the Minnesota side. The town next to Fertile is Climax. And you can, I'm not going to tell that one, but it is true. You better edit that out of the tape. But it's, and I was fortunate enough to grow up on a farm, a dairy farm, like Billy Graham. I mean, and growing up on the farm, it's a dairy farm 7 days a week, twice a day. The cows need to be milked, and you worked hard in the summer making hay and grain and all of that. So you develop a real strong work ethic. And plus a great love for the outdoors, and that stays with me today, the work ethic and the love for outdoors. And I spent many, many hours in the seat of an International Harvester tractor cutting hay, and that was just part of the upbringing. And it was a Christian home, and it was a Lutheran home. That's all there is in Minnesota, as you know, if you listen to Garrison Keeler. And Pastor Eggekvist was our pastor. I mean, it was just that way. But it was a very conservative evangelical Lutheran church where we were encouraged to have a close walk with Christ, and when we got to be teenagers, we were expected to confirm our covenant by a personal walk with Christ. We had evangelistic services and invited to go forward and receive Christ. Very unusual Lutheran church, but so that was my upbringing. I can't remember a time when I didn't know that Christ died for my sins, that God loved me and Christ died for my sins. And I remember my mom, when I must have been about 10, we were sitting around the kitchen stove, a wood stove, and she said, Wayne, do you know if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? And she was the one that made sure that I had a personal walk with Christ, which was great. But going through high school, junior high school, I kind of lived a double life. I mean, I didn't do anything bad. I wasn't into drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, or anything, but I had kind of a bad mouth and told bad jokes and got in, it was not good. It was not honoring to the Lord. But before my junior year in high school, I had a kind of a Damascus Road experience, a real meeting with Christ. And it happened this way. My cousin Beverly, we were coming back from Bible camp, and my cousin Beverly started to cry on this church bus. And what's wrong, Bev? Well, she says, I'm afraid that if I die, I won't go to heaven. Bev was a good church kid like me. I mean, I was a good church kid. People would pat me on the head and say, you ought to be a preacher someday. It was just that kind of thing. And so that night on the bus, Beverly prayed to receive Christ as her Savior and got the assurance of salvation. And that was the night that God spoke to me, not audibly, but strongly in my heart. Wayne, I want to use you to make the gospel plain to religious people that need a personal walk with Christ. It was that specific. Wow. And so for years, these people patting me on the head said, you should be a preacher. I didn't want that. I wanted to be a DJ. I loved radio. And ever since I was knee-high to a microphone, I'd wanted to be a disc jockey. And I'd go to the local radio station and hang out with the DJs, this little 1,000-watt radio station in Crookston, Minnesota, KROX, Voice of the Valley. And that's really what I wanted to do. But when that moment came, I thought, I guess I was one of those that thought if you were really dedicated to the Lord, you'd be a preacher or a missionary. And I said, I guess I'm going to be a preacher. So that was the night I said, okay, I think I'm. So I went to I graduated from high school. This was a time of revival. That thing that happened on the bus, there were dozens in our small community that came to Christ, and several of us that dedicated ourselves to serve the Lord full-time in some kind of a career ministry. And that continues even to this day. But we had a prayer group in high school, those kinds of things. We called it Youth for Christ. I don't know if YFC ever licensed us, but that's what we called it. And many kids in the high school came to the Lord during that time. I graduated from high school, and I had a pastor that said, Wayne, you need to go to Bob Jones University. Sorry about that. But because they're conservative, they're evangelical, and that's where you need to go to prepare for ministry. So off I went, this farm kid, green as grass, got on a bus, 1,400 miles to Greenville, South Carolina, to Bob Jones. During the high school years, my mom had several bouts with cancer. She had very serious cancer, and she and Dad went to Rochester, the Mayo Clinic, and left me with my 4 siblings. I was the oldest. And they'd be gone 4 or 6 weeks at a time so she could have radiation treatments and so on. So I had the kids and 40 cows and all that kind of stuff, and it was a real hard period of time. Fortunately, my grandfather, a very loving guy, would come in and spend time with us. When I came home from my first year at Bob Jones and was going to spend the summer at home working with a telephone company, I was climbing telephone poles doing, And my mom came back from Rochester and said, I have cancer again, and this time they can't do anything about it. So that was a real shock. And so I transferred from Bob Jones to the University of Minnesota, from conservative fundamentalist Bob Jones to big liberal University of Minnesota, and so that I could be closer to home. And my mom passed away that year. She was 44 when she passed away. And I was the oldest of 4. The youngest is my sister. She was 4 when Mom died, and a tough period of time, obviously. All this time, I was dating Norma. We started dating when I was a senior in high school. We were high school sweethearts, and after graduation from high school, she went to Bible school and then to nurses training. So a year after Mom died, Norma and I got married. We were kids. I was 21, she was 20. And when she graduated from nursing school, she came down to Minneapolis. But meanwhile, I was at the university, and I just for fun, because I'd always been interested in radio. Yeah, I knew I was going to be a preacher, but I could take radio courses. So I signed up for a radio course at the U and ran into a guy that had worked for the Erickson stations in Montana all summer. And he said, how do you get a job in radio? He says, you just go down and apply. So I jumped in my car, drove down to KTIS at 50 Willow Street. Paul Ramsey was there. Paul interviewed me. I had 0 experience in radio, just off the farm. I'd spent hours producing radio shows on the seat of a tractor, but never, really behind a microphone. And they were desperate. Paul hired me for Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings, and Wednesday nights. The shifts nobody wanted to work. They were 9-hour shifts. He'd start at 6 in the morning and work till 3 in the afternoon. And you'd do everything. You'd pull the music, you'd take transmitter readings, you'd turn the transmitter on and off, you'd pull the news, sweep the floor, everything. And the first Sunday, Don Malley trained me in, and I watched him. The next Sunday, he watched me, and the third Sunday, I was alone. That was my training. Can't do that today. But I loved it. I loved radio. I loved the meters and the lights and the dials and the sounds and all of that. I mean, I was just in glory. And so I graduated from the U and then enrolled in seminary. It's a free Lutheran seminary in Minneapolis. And during the seminary required you to do summer internships. So I was a summer pastor in Minnewaca, North Dakota, a tiny town of 300 people, even smaller than Fertile, if you can imagine that. And I was doing the visitation and the youth group and all this kind of stuff, and it was okay, but I came back to KTIS that fall, and Norma said she saw it in my eyes. I was sunk. So I was having the struggle between what I loved doing in my DNA radio and what I thought God wanted me to do, to be a pastor. And I remember the night like it was last week. It was one of those face in the carpet nights. I got before God and said, I just need to know peace about this. I'll serve you as a pastor in Manhole, South Dakota, if that's what you want me to do. I just want to be in your will and know your peace. And a remarkable thing happened. He released me to be in broadcasting. And all these years I had had the impression he wanted me to be this, which seemed a little bit against my nature. And here's my spin on this. He was waiting for me to be willing to give up my love for radio, to be willing to give it up, so that he could release me to do that which I was wired to do. And I often tell kids, don't hold back surrendering your life to Christ for fear of what he's going to ask you to do, because he's going to give you the desires of your heart. He's not waiting for you to surrender and then make you miserable as a missionary in Africa or something, which I think a lot of people hold back on surrendering because of what God's going to use your abilities and your passion so that you can serve with great joy and effectiveness in what you do. So I did graduate from seminary, went full-time with KTIS, and many of you know the rest of that story as I was production director and started a lot of the programs that, you know, Footprints and Discovers New Dimensions and the Good News Report and, you know, a lot of those shows. And Paul has been my mentor all these years because when he was manager, he let me do Footprints, the daily book reading. And then when he was promoted to vice president, he let me be manager. And then when he retired, I stepped into his job. And then after that, you know, he was on the HCJB board. I followed him on the HCJB board. Paul is one of my dearest friends and closest mentors and prayer warriors. I just can't say enough about Paul Ramsey and his quiet influence on my life and many other people that Paul has influenced in his quiet, gracious way. But, I mean, that's that story. And I was at KTIS for 34 years as announcer, disc jockey, which I wanted to do for a long time, but doing it for the Lord, and finally as vice president of radio there. It was while I was at Northwestern that I went on the NRB board and on the NRB executive committee, and worked with Brant Gustafson. I eventually ended up as chairman of the board of NRB, which was kind of interesting. So Brant was president, I was chairman, and you know, working with Brant, that was a kick. It was really fun. And we were a good chairman-president combination. We really worked extremely well together. And I'll never forget the day I came back from Mel Johnson's funeral, and the phone was ringing at home, and it was Brant saying, I just came back from the doctor, I have 2 months to live. And I said, good grief, I have to find a replacement for Brant Gustafson. And 2 months later, almost to the day, we made quite a few trips between Minneapolis and DC and spent time with Brant and Mary and walked through that whole thing along with Jim Gwynn. He was a big part of that too. And with Brant a week before he passed away. And Brant said, as he was laying on his bed, he looked at me and he pointed at me, he says, I want you to be the next NRB president. That was very touching. And actually, that ended up being, the board asked me to be NRB president. That didn't last very long, and I'm not going to go into that at all. It just ended, you are familiar with that story. And I ended up leaving 4 months later, driving back to Minneapolis on those icy roads past Indianapolis, and hearing Erwin Lutzer on a Moody station say, "What others intended for evil, God intended for your good." And Norm and I were driving, tears streaming down our face after this rather hurtful experience, and what's next? And it's interesting. So then Paul Cedar asked me to join Mission America. I worked for Mission America for 2 years. We had 2 offices, one in Minneapolis, one in Palm Springs. So, you know, I was born at night, but not last night. I worked the Minneapolis office in the summer and the Palm Springs in the winter. And I did that for 2 years. And I went to an NRB and ran into Joe Stoll, and Joe Stoll said, "What you're doing?" And I told him, and he says, "Well, we need a manager in Chicago." And I said something stupid like, "Yeah, call me sometime," or "Let's talk sometime." And 4 months later, I was the manager of WMBI in Chicago. Unexpected turns, God brings us. Then I found out in the interview about Bob Neff's condition, Lou Gehrig's disease. And we didn't know. But it was obvious that Joe Stoll and Ed Cannon at that point had an idea that maybe I would follow Bob Neff. So Bob Neff passed away. We walked with Bob and Miriam through that whole thing, many, many evenings together and weeping and praying and together. So Bob Neff passed away, and I stepped into his role. This is the second time I followed a dead guy into in God's providence. I don't mean to be irreverent. I love Bob Neff, and I love Brett Gustafson. These are the men that God brought into my life that shaped part of who I am today. And planned to stay at NRB, or planned to stay at Moody. Loved our time. We lived downtown Chicago, worked downtown Chicago. It was a really good life. And when I was on the board of HCJB, I was chairman of the President's Committee, which reviewed the president. My first meeting with Dave Johnson, he said, "I want to retire. I want to resign." Nice job. I did a really good job. And what's going on? He says, "I'm burnt out. I'm only sleeping 2 hours a night. I can't sleep. I can't think. I can't concentrate, and I need to resign." Well, the committee said, "No, take 3 months off. Get healthy." So he came back 3 months later and he says, "Well, I'm healthy now, but I still want to resign." So we formed a search committee. I volunteered to be on the search committee, and I found myself. It's not that simple. It went from 60 names to 30 to 15, and when it was down to 12, they said, "Wayne, you need to get off the committee because you're one of the names on the committee." That May of 2008, Norm was in Minneapolis, I was alone in Chicago, and I said, "I've got to get some answers on this." And I have to say, I have to watch the time here. How are we doing? We're okay. Rewind a little bit. When this NRB was coming up in 2001, I was at an HCJB meeting, and is that me? No. That's me. Go away.
Go away.
It'll ring a few times here. HCJB had one of their broadcasters conferences at Glen Eyrie. And I knew this NRB thing was coming my way. Ron Klein was speaking. And Ron talked about when he was invited to be president of HCJB. And he didn't know what to do. He was pastoring the English Fellowship Church in Quito. And HCJB asked him to be president. So he didn't know what to do, so he decided to take a bag and go check in and stay at the beach for a week and hear God's answer. Well, with Ron Klein, it doesn't take a week to hear God's answer. He put on his sandals, went walking on the beach, and in 15 minutes he had his answer. And the answer from God to Ron was, "Let your name stand and let me, God, make the decision." So he packed his bag and went back to Quito, and he used that as advice. So I went up to him and I said, "Ron, it looks like this NRB thing might be, what should I do? I'm at Northwestern, I don't need to change jobs, I like what I'm doing." He said, "Well, I recommend let your name stand and let God make the decision." Ron and I are here at NRB, and I have lunch with Ron, the former president. I said, "Ron, it looks like this NRB thing, or the HCJB thing is coming my way. What should I do?" And he says, "Wayne, let your name stand and let God make the decision." So the title of this talk is, "Let your name stand and let God make the decision." And I had no interest in leaving Moody or anything like that, but I took this day, Saturday, and I got before the Lord. You've done it. the yellow pad, the pen, and the Bible. Okay, God, tell me what to do. You know, I'm filling out the 2 columns, you know, and reading, in my regular reading, I'm in Romans 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that whole section. And Romans 15, 20, Paul said, "It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where the name of Christ has not been heard." Whoa, interesting. I'm asking God today, and that word pops up. And all those verses about that, how shall they hear without a preacher, how without somebody sent? And it was more than a coincidence that these verses about the gospel going to the ends of the earth, to every tribe, every nation, that was all in there. And so the answer I had from the Lord that day was, Wayne, if this is offered to you, you can't say no. It didn't say I was going to get, but God said, if this is offered to you, you can't say no. So back in May, the decision was already made what would happen in September. So Glenn Adams, who was the chairman of the search committee, it was a week before board meetings in September, and I called Glenn. There were 2 candidates, me and some other guy. And I said, is the other guy a good candidate? Oh yeah, he's a great candidate, really good guy. Well, I said, pick him. I don't want to move, I don't want to change jobs, I'm happy where I am, pick the other guy. So they had a search committee meeting, and they picked the other guy, unbeknownst to me. So I come into Colorado Springs, walk into HCJB, the search committee is meeting in Dick Jacquin's office over there, and I'm getting ready to go to a board meeting. And unbeknownst to me, Ron Klein, who took my place on the search committee, I blame him again, said, guys, I've been praying about this, and we picked the wrong guy. Wayne is our guy. Thanks, Rod. And they went around the circle. Tim Tomlinson was on the search committee, and he said, Ron, I have the same feeling. Wayne is our guy. Wow. And they went around, and to the person around the room, they all, during that week, individually had God saying, we need to pick Wayne. So what do you say to that? I mean, a total God thing. So I'm on the phone. Norma's in Chicago with friends from Minneapolis, and I said, Norma, guess what? I think we're moving. So I had to go back to Chicago, tell Ed Cannon, guess what, Ed? And oh, it was hard. There was tears. We cried, and Ed cried, and the staff cried. We love the people at Moody. It was, but that's that story, and it's very much a God thing. But honestly, to be at this end of my career, I'm 65, and to focus on a job that it will make an eternal global impact, and that's what HCJB does, the whole thing about reaching the hard-to-reach places. I couldn't be more fulfilled. It's the most challenging job I've ever had, but the most fulfilling, to see places like Thailand, 0.5% Christian, and we're planning 100 radio stations there. Wow. Nepal, which 4 years ago was a Hindu-controlled government, we've put 8 stations there. And as a result of stations, they're planting churches. Our partner in Indonesia, we've put in about 50 stations. He's planted 1,700 house churches out of those 50 stations. In North Africa, Middle East, some of the most challenging places in the world, you know, Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, the Gulf region. The study done by the same group that does BBC and Voice of America says we have 1.7 million listeners a week in North Africa, the top 7 countries. And we cover about 20 countries with our satellite footprint. So only eternity will reveal, because people can't respond with the oppression. Yeah. We had, did you see yesterday, one of our trainers was just arrested and put in prison by the authorities just yesterday. They found out that he was doing broadcasts for us, and they arrested him and put him in jail. So that it's, these people, they put their lives on the line for the gospel each and every day. It's so humbling. Our partner in Indonesia, he's on a hit list for the jihad. Somebody could kill him and not be prosecuted. And I said, how do you do this? And he said, I just do what I'm called to do, and I don't worry about it. So it's such an honor, such a privilege to work in such an important strategic ministry. Life lessons from this would be, if Mom had not gotten sick, I would not have gone to the University of Minnesota. I would not have gone to KTIS to get a job. And you know, I see God's thread through all of this. And you see how God takes even bad stuff and makes good things out of it. God had this plan for my life, and I don't know if my siblings see it, but I certainly see the good that came out of that bad. And even the NRB thing, I just think that was, I learned so much during that time, made so many friends, so many contacts that helped me today in what God has called me and Steve and our colleagues to do. And those relationships that I made during that time are just very key. So Romans 8:28, God works all things together for the good of those that love God and are called according to his purpose. There are those conditions there to love God and called, but God works all things. And it's not all things work together, it's God works all things together for our good. And then the other principle out of this is delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. If you put him first in your life and delight in him. And that was the whole radio thing. My love for radio since I was 7 years old, playing radio in my room, that was the desire of my heart. But putting God first, he allowed me to do that. I mean, what a privilege. I've been so blessed. And, leave your choices to God, and he's going to do the best thing. And then this whole thing about letting God decide, the Ron Klein thing, as much as he annoys me with that phrase. We kid about that all the time. I mean, let God make those decisions. And that doesn't mean you're totally passive, but, you go through the doors God opens, and you move on from the doors that he closes. And every experience, Northwestern, Mission America, Moody, NRB, they've all been important building blocks in my life, and I see God's goodness through all of that, God's guiding hand. So it's all praise to him. So that's what I wanted to share, just God's blessing and God's guidance in my life.
I hope this won't sound silly, but when you say let God decide part, that means you're not getting in there and working the situation, making phone calls.
Yeah.
You're just letting things be.
Yeah.
You're responsible, you just keep about his business, and then you just don't get in there and work it.
I've never pursued any of these jobs. I didn't ask to be KTIS manager or vice president of radio. I didn't ask for the WMBI job. And that was, managing WMBI was a kick. That was a fun job. The VP job was harder. The NRB thing, it was, I was kicking and screaming on that until Ron said, hey, you need to let God guide on this one. So I've never pursued or applied for anything. It's totally been a God thing. And there's a great freedom that comes with that. Any other questions or comments?
That was, when I listened to you, Wayne, there's a lot of new things I found out about you, but I'm impressed again that we need to share our stories. Yeah, there's so much that comes from an individual's stories, even though we tend to feel reluctant to do it because it's all about us. It really isn't. There was nothing in your story that was all about you.
Well, I've learned that, Evelyn. I've really learned that a story, even this, I always thought my conversion story was pretty vanilla. I never did drugs or sex or beat my wife or anything, that's dramatic like that. But my walk with Christ has not been so much as an event as a continuum.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even today, as long as I've been walking with the Lord, I'm still learning big time what it means to follow Christ. I'm not there yet.